Tonight, we're very excited, honoured and privileged to welcome Ash Bhardwaj.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Evening, guys. I'm just going to move that out of the way so it feels less like a lecture and more like a conversation. So, let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. So, these three pictures kind of summarise what I've done up until now to make my career what it is. So on the left, you've got the front cover of a newspaper. That's the Telegraph travel section, Discover. That was the first time I got the front cover of a national newspaper. In fact, it's the only time I've got the front cover of a national newspaper. And that was for the journey we just heard about. That was when I joined Levison Wood for the Sudan leg of walking the Nile. So that was Lev Wood's first big expedition. He and I had gone to university together, and he basically needed somebody to keep him company. And I knew how to film, and therefore I was able to go out and join him on this expedition, filmed it for the Channel 4 TV series, and then wrote it up as an article for the Telegraph, and that's how that got there. The bottom right, that is a picture of me with a video camera, so that's what we make the expeditions on. So people often ask me, what kit do you use to film this stuff? And that camera there is actually good enough to film stuff that you can put on TV. You can film 4K with a camera that size, but that one was actually an HD one. There's all the microphones stuck on top. And then at the top, that is a belt buckle from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is the school where you learn how to be an officer. And it's a place where you learn values and ways of, I guess it's values for yourself that you can then use to lead other people. And the phrase, the motto of Sandhurst is serve to lead. And that's very much the idea that you do things for the good of your men. You're not there as a leader so that everybody follows you because you've been given this badge as an officer in the army, but because you know what you're doing, and therefore you should inspire them and look after them, and therefore they will follow you. And those two things actually come together fairly well, and the combination of those are what can give me the career of being an adventurer. That's the kind of label that I've been given. But really, where it came from is not knowing what to do in the first place. So I had no idea what to do when I left school and university. I did philosophy as a degree, which allows you to think really well and develop critical thinking, but it wasn't a vocational career. And about 17 years later not 17 years from university, 17 years since leaving school, I finally got to the point where I feel that these different elements and these different interests are coming together. And I'm going to cover a bit of that this evening and also talk to you a bit about my advice and the things that I've learned. So my advice comes through experience about how to make the most out of travel and things to think about when you're considering your journeys. So the one I'm going to go through this evening is what I think is things to do, how to travel, how to make the most out of your travel, what to do next if you're thinking about going on a journey. I know some of you guys are doing the World Challenge trip, and then my values and standards that I've learned from people who've inspired me, and those are the ones that have inspired me. They may not be the kind of things that inspire you or lead you onto other things, but I think if there are people that you view as heroes in your life or people that inspire you, you can take lessons from them, and that can help you in whatever you choose to do next. I'll go through that. But first, a warning. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. This is sage advice from Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, to his nephew Frodo Baggins, and he tells him this in Lord of the Rings. And I think this is a piece of advice that I would certainly make sure you consider before you start traveling, because inevitably your first experience of travel will have moments of being unpleasant, moments of challenge, moments where you wish you were home. But as soon as you get home, you'll be starting to think about the next thing that you can do that will lead you on to your next great adventure. So, how to travel. This was my first trip away from home. Does anybody know where this is? I know some of you are going to see it. Yes? It's the Taj Mahal. And the Taj Mahal is a building in Agra in India, and it was built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and is built as a memorial to the woman he loved. But this was one of the first places I travelled to on my own. My father was Indian, and so during my year between university and school and university in that order, I decided to go traveling around India to go and have a little look at my heritage. And I was terrible at traveling. I didn't really know what to do. I'd done a decent amount of research in Lonely Planet and The Footprint, but I had long periods of being entirely on my own, feeling quite miserable, feeling quite sorry for myself, really wishing I was home. I was poorly a few times. And I hadn't really thought about what I was trying to get out of it. I just kind of went on my journey. But it was an essential thing for me to do because, first of all, it gives me something to talk about, and I can tell you guys about it. But also, it allowed me to learn some of the skills that I could improve on later on. So having your first travel experience being difficult or challenging, that's absolutely fine. Because when I look back on it and remember all the other things, I learned a huge amount of really useful skills that were good for the journeys that happened afterwards. But also I've got some amazing memories, times where I can remember standing on top of a mountain overlooking Pushkar, which is a city in Rajasthan. It's a really holy city, and seeing the sun come up there, or seeing Everest for the very first time, or being in Varanasi and seeing bodies being cremated and seeing this site of religious ritual of which there's no compare anywhere else in the world. And these memories have altered who I am. They've altered my understanding of the world, even though I was really rubbish at traveling. And the things I have learned from that is to have a bit more of a plan when I go traveling. So the first thing I would say is if you're trying to work out what to do or where to go or what to do once you get there, it's to go for your hobbies. So this is me with a cowboy hat, in case you need the explanation of the image. And that's because when I was at university, as I said, I did philosophy, so I had no idea what to do next. But there were three things I knew that I wanted to do. I wanted to be a cowboy, I didn't really care where. I wanted to play rugby in New Zealand, and I wanted to be a ski instructor. Now, I didn't really know how to ride a horse. I was rubbish at rugby, and I had been on one ski holiday in which I managed to get down a green run. That was the limit of my things. But I was setting my ambitions fairly high in all three levels. And then I knew that there were two places in the world, really, that spoke English and had a cowboy culture: Australia and America. And I knew I wanted to go to one of these, and I knew more people in Australia than I did in America. So I went to Australia to be a cowboy. That was literally the planning that went into this. So there I am in Australia, learning how to be a cowboy. And it was an interesting experience. Being a cowboy actually involves a lot of time working with sheep. And this is where rugby and cowboying came into use, because there's this thing called, I can't even remember what it's called, rousing, where you basically have to separate the sheep from male into female sheep. Actually, no, not from male into female. It's to separate the lambs from the mothers, from the ewes. If any of you have family that own farms, sheep farms, you will know about this. But basically, you get a pen full of the sheep with the mothers and the lambs, and you make them run down a really narrow channel, and then you have a gate, and you kind of shuffle between them so that the lambs go on one side and the mothers go on the other. Now, every now and again, one of the sheep goes into the wrong pen. So every now and again, the mother, the ewes, would go into the lamb pen, and the cowboy, the guy whose farm it was, like, "Ash, mate, when you get over there, if any of the ewes get in, pick them up, chuck them over, get them in the other fence." Oh, right, okay. So there I am, stood there, and there's a ewe running towards me, and obviously I dive for it and miss it. And he's like, "Ash, mate, look, really, don't be gentle with them. If you just, get him, smash him, chuck him over in the fence." I'm like, "Oh, okay, I've played rugby, I know how this goes." So there I am, stood in this sheep pen with all these lambs running at me, and suddenly a ewe runs at me. "Ash, get her!" And let sheep run towards me. I spear tackle her, pick her up, chuck her over the fence, and look very pleased with myself. It's like, "Oh, righto, mate, didn't mean for you to try and kill her, but, a little more gentle next time, please." So that was my first experience of being a cowboy. And I travelled up the east coast of Australia, worked on a couple of horse farms. These are two yearlings, baby horses, running around. And this was an amazing experience, because what I hadn't expected from this is I just wanted to basically ride horses around, wear a cowboy hat, and look a bit heroic on a horse. But what it gave me is access to a part of Australia that I never would have seen otherwise. It's very easy to go to Australia, travel up and down the east coast, go to Sydney and Brisbane and Cairns, get drunk, hang around on beaches, sail around on the boats, have a good time, but not really see anything that isn't just a hot version of England. Whereas if you go inland, it's a completely different culture. There's nowhere like this in Britain. There's nowhere that has the same kind of farming cowboy culture, and there's certainly nowhere that you can go and ride around horses for miles and miles without anything in the way. And the guys that I met out there, this is the farm that I worked on. It was actually a racehorse farm. They bred racehorses there. And these guys are friends for life. And I went back a couple of years ago, stayed on the farm again, And these are memories that I will take with me for the rest of my life. The Australian, they're actually called jackaroos in Australia. So having that hobby of that interest in wanting to ride a horse and be a cowboy gave me an insight into a part of Australian culture that none of my friends who've lived in Australia for years even know about. Guys who've lived down in Sydney or Brisbane wouldn't know about this. The second one was rugby. This guy, anyone know who this is? Rugby players. There's some rugby players, I'm sure. Anyone know who this guy is in the middle? He was an All Black. Wow, nobody knows. This is Sean Fitzpatrick. He was one of the best hookers of all time. And he is the reason why you get sin-binned. So the yellow card in rugby was created for him because he was such a good cheat that they needed to find a way to stop him. And I played rugby at Windsor, and I wasn't particularly good. But inspired by people like Sean Fitzpatrick, I was like, I'm going to go and play rugby in New Zealand. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out a lot can go wrong, because in my first session, I was thinking that it would be a bit like, like when you do those light contact sessions in rugby where you're just sort of going through the motions and somebody gets tackled and you go down and you stand on for the ruck as if, like I'm here, but we're not going full contact. Well, they would go full contact from the very outset. And I went in and sort of put myself near a rock, and the next thing I knew, I had been knocked out. So a very powerful introduction to Kiwi rugby. And again, this is another really unique insight into a culture you think on the surface looks very much like English culture. New Zealand, they speak English. They're largely emigrants from Scotland and England, as well as the Maori culture there. But on the surface, it doesn't look particularly different to England. But by living out in this part of New Zealand, and this was the rugby field. Has this got a laser? No. Down here, that is the rugby field down there. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable place to play rugby in. And you didn't have to run up and down the mountain every day, but a lot of the guys did. That's why they were so fit. And this was where we would go and play our games of rugby. And we'd drive around for up to 2 or 3 hours on a Saturday, seeing all the other rugby clubs nearby. And that was our local games. And you turn up in a coach, drive for 2.5, 3 hours, and there'd just be a field in the middle of nowhere with mountains in the background. And you'd be like, there's some rugby posts and there's a hut here. Where the rugby players. And then over the next 30 minutes, a few utes. A ute is a utility vehicle. It's like a truck, they call them in the States, but not like a articulated lorry, a thing with a flatbed on the back. They turn up maybe with a sheep tied up in the back for dinner later on. And then they would all get out and have just finished their farming work in the morning. You play a game of rugby, and like 300 or 400 people would turn up, like their families and their kids and their cousins, to watch you play a game of local provincial rugby. These guys were, again, that's a view that we had while we were playing rugby. And these guys were local blokes, local farmers, and again, it gave me a great insight into a part of Kiwi culture that I never would have had. I also learned how to ski whilst I was there, another great place for taking heroic-looking photos. And then that gave me a job in New Zealand, in Switzerland afterwards, teaching skiing. So I eventually got a job as a ski instructor as well. So by going for my hobbies, these are not the most challenging adventures you can have in the world. But if you're trying to trigger the ideas of, if I want to go somewhere, what can I do once I get there? There's worse things you can do than go for a hobby. We were traveling through Uganda. So Uganda is Central Africa. It's a former British colony, and it's effectively got two geographical and ethnic regions. In the south, it's the Uganda. They're much more settled, agrarian. That's where the British had most of their colonial power, around the capital. And then in the north, you have the Luo, who are much more like the Maasai of Kenya. They're cattle herdsmen generally, more of a sort of hunter-warrior mentality as they move their herds around. Cattle theft is much more of a thing, so it's a very different culture. It was much harder for the British to dominate whilst they were there. And whilst we were travelling through this region, 40 years after the British had left, we found that it was a place that had a terrible affliction, that sadly is a product, to an extent, of Britain. And every village we went to, we saw people that had suffering from the same thing, which was a delusion that Arsenal were a good football team. And in every town that I went to, time and time again, I saw people that were suffering this same misconception that one day Arsenal will win the league. Now, I am not much of a football fan, as those of you who I was speaking to earlier on know. But what this did is it gave me a chance to speak to people. And one of my best friends is a massive Arsenal fan. In fact, he writes for Arsenal. And I thought this was bizarre. Like these photos these ones here is on the north of a place called Lake Choga. They do not have electricity. They do not have a road. They do not have running water. They do not have a police service. I mean, this is as rural as it gets in Uganda. It's 4 days' walk to the nearest market town. And they had the latest Arsenal shirts, like weeks after they'd been released. And I thought, this is definitely an interesting sociological phenomenon. And it gave me a reason to talk to people and say, why do you guys, first of all, why do you support Arsenal? But why do you have these shirts so quickly? And it turns out that the reason they support Arsenal is because as the Premier League became international in the 1990s, most of the black football players in the Premier League played for Arsenal. Guys like Ian Wright, and then, what was that, Kano? I mean, I have, again, I'm telling you, I know nothing about football. But I just thought it was interesting that Arsenal was a team that they all supported. Not Manchester United, not Manchester City, teams with much more recent success. But during that time in the 90s, not only did Arsenal have most black players, but they also were good at that time. They were also winning the league. And they also played a style of football that was very appealing to Ugandans. They had an attacking, fast-flowing style of football. This is before Wenger got really boring. And they still support the team today. And whenever Arsenal play a game, the generator in the town is turned on, everybody packs into a hut and watches the Arsenal game. And their statistical knowledge of English football is phenomenal. They knew which linesman had a higher proportion of giving penalties or referees penalties against Arsenal. I mean, that's a phenomenal level of statistical knowledge I didn't even know existed. But the other thing, of course, it did is it broke the ice. I could say, why do you support Arsenal? I live in Tottenham. And then that would be a reason to start talking to them. And then I could ask them other things about, well, where do you get this Arsenal shirt from? Well, basically, I walk to the town, and we know that someone will have produced some fake copies that we can buy 2 days after they come out in London. 2 days after they release a new shirt, you can buy it in the middle of Uganda for about a tenth of the price. So, yeah, hunt for the unexpected. If you see something that really stands out and you think, why is that? Go and speak to people about it. That's Highbury as well, Arsenal Stadium. Follow your heroes. So this is another reason I like travelling. If I've heard a story that inspires me and I want to find out a bit more about it, I'll literally go and retrace it. This guy was a special operations executive brigadier in World War II. His name was Brigadier Trotsky Davies. And whilst the Germans were occupying Albania, which is on the Adriatic and in Eastern Europe, down near Yugoslavia on the way to Greece, in World War II, the Germans had occupied Albania to stop the British reinforcing the garrison in Greece. Technical. And the British decided they needed to stop this. So he sent in secret forces to try and stir up a rebellion in Albania. I had no idea about this until I read this book and thought, that is interesting. Where's Albania? So I decided I would go to Albania and follow in the footsteps of this guy. This is the first town that we stopped in. This is where he got parachuted in 1944.
So this is one of the old buildings from the communist farm town. It's been turned into a cafe. And you've got the guys in the back there having the traditional Albanian breakfast of coffee, raki and cigarettes.
So obviously this building wasn't there when Trotsky Davies parachuted in because it's a product of the communist era that was set up by the British ally from the Albanian time. But the reason why I'm showing you that video is I'd gone there to follow in the footsteps of this British soldier, and I found this bizarre scene where we had Albanian NATO soldiers with machine guns coming in drinking whiskey for breakfast, which I just thought was an odd thing and also slightly alarming when guys with machine guns are drinking whiskey for breakfast. But it just gave me, again, a route into looking into this culture. Why does Albania have a communist heritage? What were the causes of it? And why did the British have a impact on that? Why was this, in some ways, the British's fault? So we walked around, we spent a few days camping outside, we were walking up and down the hills about 10 miles a day, and the route that we were following was a route that this guy, Brigadier Trotsky Davies, and his team had to escape from the Germans. They were found, and they basically went on an escape route that took them in a big circle. And we followed it, and we found these tunnels. And what these tunnels were was the guy that was the British ally during this campaign ended up becoming an ally of Stalin, and Stalin being the Soviet leader of Russia, the Soviet Union. And they were terrified that they were going to be invaded by Yugoslavia or the British. So they built these massive underground networks of these tunnels that they could retreat into in the event of an invasion. And in them, they stored loads and loads of weapons. And then when Albania's communist regime collapsed in the 90s, these weapon caches were stolen by criminals, basically, who started a civil war and eventually sold those weapons into places like Kosovo. Now, the weapons that ISIS were using to fight in the last war, and which actually the terrorists that did the Bataclan attack in 2014 in Paris, those weapons originated from Bosnia. So this is an example of how the things that affect us in the modern day can have a cause that dates back to not just the communist era of Albania, but the British being there and supporting a guy who eventually became the communist dictator. So the other reason why I find going on these journeys interesting is it can give me an understanding of the modern day by seeing what's happening there. I knew nothing about this before I left, but all of a sudden I had a new insight. And Albania today is a beautiful place. This is a scene that wouldn't have changed in this era since the Middle Ages. They're still harvesting the wheat with hand scythes. This is the local bus. And this is the point where Trotsky Davies was eventually captured. I mean, it's a beautiful view. When he was there, it was the middle of winter and they had snow up to their waists. They hadn't eaten for a few days, and Trotsky Davies and two other men were eventually captured. And his bodyguard fought off the Albanian-German collaborators with a pistol, and when his pistol ran out, he threw the empty pistol at them, and then when his empty pistol ran out, he fought them with his fists, and they had rifles. Eventually they were captured. But the town down here is called Kostenia. Kostenia? Yeah, Kostenia. And this guy is basically the leader of the village. For those of you who remember the 80s, he also looks like a very aged Phil Collins. But he was the mayor of the village, and during the Soviet time, he'd been the commissar. Now, what the commissar is, he's basically the political officer that makes sure that anybody who's doing anything that isn't pro-communist gets reported. And so he was basically the snitch that got people imprisoned. But he had this quite sweet phrase, which was, during the time of World War II, the Albanians and the British were allies. Then during the Soviet era, we were enemies. And now Albania's joined NATO. Now we're allies again. He said, the strange thing is, as I sat down drinking coffee and whiskey for breakfast, the strange thing is I think we would have always been friends. And this is another thing that I found interesting about these journeys, is it really breaks down your understanding of places that you think are your enemies, or you think are very different to you. When it comes down to it, that human connection and just getting to know somebody is what, it sounds very hippie-ish, but it's the chance for peace in the world. If you keep putting up barriers and you don't visit places, you won't understand them and you won't make decisions that are good for you and them. And this is another quote that I found that I quite liked. At the end of all of our exploring, the aim will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. So in relating to that point I just made about meeting the guy, one of the things that you do learn about going to these places and seeing things that you didn't expect is you come home and see your own country in a different way. You know, I haven't been to Yorkshire many times. So by seeing how much joy I can have going to Albania, it makes me go to Yorkshire and go, oh, I wonder what Doncaster's like. I'll go check it out. But you just have this curiosity about things that you presume you know nothing about. You take that same curiosity to yourself when you go back home. And I think it makes you appreciate the land that you come from that much more. How to travel. Right, I know I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll try not turn this into too much of a lecture. So go for your hobbies, hunt for the unexpected, follow your heroes, and all of these things that comes down to learning. So the importance of heroes. So this man is the first man that really inspired me. Does anybody know who this is? Anybody? Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Starship Enterprise, Galaxy class USS Enterprise NCC 1701D. Now, I was not much of an outdoorsman as a kid, but I loved Star Trek. And through watching Star Trek, through watching this guy, I learned things. I learned things from his leadership values. Whenever they had a problem with the Borg, Worf would be like, we just have to smash them. And Deanna would be like, no, we have to understand them. And Data would be like, let's do some science. But what did he do? He got all of the people in the room together and he understood them and he modulated his behavior and he made sure he didn't take a rash decision. So I got to a point when I was making decisions, I think, what would Picard do? And it made me more measured. It made me think more about things. It probably improved my long-term leadership. It gave me an interest in exploration. The Enterprise, as we all know, was an exploration vessel, not a military vessel. But the Starfleet that they came from is a semi-military organisation. So that notion of joining a service and for exploring, that definitely came from him. So he was an inspiration to me. Does anybody know who this is? Come on, someone must know who this is. Yep. J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books. Now, J.K. Rowling is an inspiration to me because she was rejected by so many publishers before the first Harry Potter book got published. So she had a great sense of endeavour and commitment. When I'm doing my writing and I'm not sure what to do, how to do it, should I keep going, when I'm being rejected for every pitch by every newspaper, I think about the fact that Harry Potter eventually got published. And I think maybe I could write the next Harry Potter. No, I don't think that. But I do think the same level of commitment and endeavour. So whenever I'm out doing an expedition and I'm not sure if I should keep going, whether I don't have the belief in my content or the creativity that I'm doing of creating a film or an article or a radio piece, I'll think back to J.K. Rowling's experience. If she could do it, with a couple of kids and also living in a small flat in Edinburgh, then I don't have any kids, then I definitely don't have the same pressure she did. And this guy, does anyone know who this is? He's been in a couple of movies. Winston Churchill. Now, when people see Churchill, they tend to think of a few things. They think of heroics, determination, great public speaking, great success, defeating an enemy. What they don't know, well, some of you may know this if you've done A-level history, before he achieved all of those things, he was kicked out of government for one of the worst military disasters in history at the Battle of Gallipoli. He had a stutter and he had a lisp. He also suffered from debilitating depression all throughout his life. He defeated those things within himself through experience and through practice, reassurance and education. Actually, the depression was something he dealt with all of his life, and he probably didn't take the right route of self-medication, which was primarily whiskey, brandy and champagne. But then there weren't the same levels of mental health understanding during that era. But it reminds me that humans are fallible, and that even those that do great things start off by not being able to do great things well. And often you don't find your success in life until later on, and it can often be in things that you think you've failed at already. And when I look back at some of my first attempts to get commissions for travel pieces or for TV pieces, they were rejected. And so for me, that rejection and that struggle is something that made me better at those things and eventually led on to me doing those things well. They weren't necessarily always my passions, but I just became really good at them, largely through being bad at them to start with. So that is something that I take from him, and it's something I take when I go and do my expeditions. Like I said, I wasn't very good at packing my kit on the first ones. I wasn't very fit. I wasn't very good at talking to people. But I learnt those things and got better at them as I went on. And this one. This guy on the left, Levison Wood, he's one of the best-known TV explorers at the moment. And what I learned from him, he had a great phrase. He said, it's easy to come up with a great idea. It's also easy to continue and finish an expedition once you're out there. Because once you're on an expedition, you've got nothing better to do than walk 25 miles a day, so you're probably not going to quit. The hard thing is getting from the idea to the start line, to turn that vision into a reality. So that's what I've learned from this guy. Whenever I'm trying to do things and I'm thinking this is going to be hard, or I've got a great vision and I know that I can do it once I get there, it's getting to the start line that's the hard part. So it's the willingness and the nitty-gritty to be good at what you're doing and work that bit extra harder. Having the passion is not good enough, because there are a lot of people with a passion, but it's having the willingness to do the nitty-gritty and get out there. That's what I learned from this guy. The opportunistic second. How long have I got? 5 minutes? Okay, I'll try not to be as long as you want, because I'm sure some of you want to get home. The opportunistic second. So this is something that I've tried to do more of over the last few years. This guy is a bloke called Sir Che Blythe. He was a soldier in the British Army, and he had a vision for his life. He knew that he was going to become, he was a sergeant, he was going to become a colour sergeant, a sergeant major, be toured around all the various bases that Britain had back in the 50s and 60s, Germany, Malaya. He knew that's what was going to happen. One day, his captain turned up to him and said, "Sergeant Blythe, I need a man. I need a man to row the Atlantic with me." And Che Blythe said, "I've got just the man for you, sir. He'll be in your office tomorrow morning." So the Captain John Ridgway, was waiting in his office. The next morning, Che Blythe turned up. And he said, "Hey, Sergeant Blythe, I didn't know you could row." He goes, "I can't, sir, but I will learn." 92 days they spent rowing the Atlantic. It was a world record. They went through 2 hurricanes, and they had to turn back from the initial one. And they set off in 1966, and it was a record that took years to break. So they rowed from New England all the way to Ireland, and they were the first pair to row the Atlantic in that direction. And they beat a team that had set out before them by 30 days. In fact, another team that went out at the same time perished because of the conditions. But when they turned up at New York Harbour and they had to do the photo shoot, Ridgway was poorly, and Blythe had to be in the harbour doing the photo shoot. And this was literally the first time he got into a rowing boat. Literally the first time he'd been in a rowing boat. And he's just about to row the Atlantic. 92 days in a boat. And the journalist said to him, well, what are you going to do? When are you going to learn how to row? He said, well, I'm rowing the Atlantic. I've got nothing better to do. I'm sure I'll learn it out there. And the lesson that I learned from him was to take the opportunistic second. If somebody offers you something, just say yes. I mean, obviously there are certain levels to this, and certainly if somebody says to you, would you mind doing this open heart surgery on the person? Probably best to go and get some training first. And I don't mean that you should be foolhardy about stuff. Do not go up Everest with no kit and no oxygen. But when somebody offers you an opportunity and you're not quite sure how it's going to be, you know it's going to be hard, but you know it could change your life and be something remarkable, say yes, and then often you can work out how to do it afterwards. Just turn up. Okay, does anybody know who this is? Yep. Sorry? Ran Fiennes. So Ran Fiennes, the greatest living explorer. This is a man who chopped off his own fingers because the frostbite was hurting him too much. This is a man who ran 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 different continents, weeks after he'd had a heart attack. This is a man who climbed Everest despite having vertigo. This is the only man to have done a circumpolar navigation and crossed both poles by human power. The man is the greatest living explorer, and he had long been someone that I looked up to. And then this time, not this time last year, about 4 months ago, I ended up on stage at the Royal Geographical Society with Sir Ranulph Fiennes, which was sort of a, if you like, a vision that I'd had years before. I'd love to meet Sir Ranulph Fiennes. And there I was, meeting Sir Ranulph Fiennes. It was 10 years since I did my first email blog post. It was 7 since I did my first proper blog post. It was 5 years since I got my first commission for a newspaper, writing free for a newspaper called City AM. And it was 3 years after I'd filmed the first series with Levison Wood. So it had taken me 10 years to get from the point of just starting to try something, not even knowing I wanted a career in it, but just starting out in it. 10 years later, I ended up in a place that I didn't really expect to be, didn't really plan to be. I had no route for how to get there. But as I went along this path, I started to work out what I wanted to do more. The lesson I've taken from this is that it takes a long time and it takes a lot of hard work to get to a place where you can make a career out of what you want to be. My girlfriend is a surgeon, and she has got another 7 years until she qualifies as a paediatric surgeon. She's already been in medical training for 10 years. It is 17 years until she gets where she wants. And she accepts that. She's like, that's fine. For some reason, people that go into travel journalism seem to think, oh, I'm just going to write an article about Everest and everybody will publish it. But my experience is it takes 7 to 10 years to do something. There was a guy called Niles Barkley. Anybody heard of him? Singer. A great quote from him. It took me 10 years to become an overnight success. And you can't, Arnold Schwarzenegger, so I'm full of quotes this evening, I don't know where they're all coming from. Arnold Schwarzenegger says, you can't climb the ladder of success with your hands in your pockets. You have to do the hard graft, you have to do these things, be bad at things, experiment, try, learn, and eventually you end up going in a direction it might not be where you expect to end up. So it's a winding path. People only see, oh God, I've got another quote. I'm not going to give you another quote. I'll skip over that. And that's it. I guess that's my final thing for you guys. To get to where I am, I've done a whole host of things that didn't work out. I tried doing capoeira at university. I tried acting at university, just in my free time. I did French lessons. I did German lessons. I did Russian lessons. I've only ended up keeping the French. And I tried jobs in recruitment, I tried jobs in land sales, but it's only by experimenting with all these things and following this winding path that I've eventually ended up doing these things that I have enjoyed, pursuing them, getting better at them and taking me to where I am. So if you don't know where you are and you don't know what your passion is, neither of those things are too much of a problem. Go traveling and follow those 3 rules of advice. Go for your hobbies, hunt for the unexpected, and what was the third one? I've forgotten momentarily. That's embarrassing. My mind's gone blank. I'll remember it in a minute. And it's only by doing all those different things that you'll find out where you want to be. Thank you.